Hi and welcome to session number 11. This one I'm just continuing with principles of flight, so carrying on from session number 10. So in this session we're going to look first of all at some technical terms that you need to get your head around really. So these are the terms that we are using all the time when we're talking about how the aircraft flies. So chord, I've mentioned this already in previous things. It's a line going from the center of the trailing edge through the center of the leading edge. So in other words, straight from the front to the back of the aerofoil. We just use that as a datum really when we're discussing the angle of attack. The angle of attack is the angle between that chord line and the relative airflow. So the direction of travel, if you like. Okay, aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is another term, and this refers to the shape of the glider or the wing. We're used to using the term aspect ratio when we're talking about TVs and things like that, and usually it means the width in as a proportion of the height of something. So, you know, width, something that's 9 by 6 or something like that. However, in a wing, particularly like a paraglider, that is a complex shape. It's not only an elliptical shape, it's also curved. That's not a very effective way of doing it. So the ratio is worked out slightly differently. So it's often calculated by most manufacturers, I think now, as the square of the span of the wing, so distance from tip to tip, divided by the area. So for an example, a glider that has a span of say 11.5 meters, so it's 11.5 times 11.5 is 132.5 meters, divided by the area of the wing, which let's say is 26 square meters, and that would calculate out as an aspect ratio of just over 5. So that's the aspect ratio, but even that is a bit complicated because that's easy to do when the thing's lying on the flat, but in the air it takes up a curved shape. So if you imagine a sort of infinite light source, as it were, shining through it, so you've got a shadow. The shadow is the projected aspect ratio, the projected shape. So you'll often find, which will always be a slightly lower figure, because obviously it's not, you know, not quite stretched out as it will be when it's flat. So in a lot of manufacturers' information, you'll actually see an aspect ratio, let's say it's 6, and then a projected aspect ratio of 5.5 or something like that. Okay, so it's just a way of getting an accurate picture, but that's what aspect ratio means anyway. It's important to us because the aspect ratio tells us a lot about the glider. Basically, a high aspect ratio gives high performance because it has less induced drag on the tips, various things, better glide performance in particular. But unfortunately, a long, thin wing is also more difficult to control in turbulence, and it may be less easy to recover if it has collapses. So you tend to have high performance but low stability. Whereas a low aspect ratio wing will obviously be the other way around. Reduce the performance somewhat, particularly the glide at speed, but it'll be much more stable and easier to get out. So beginners gliders, school type gliders tend to be lower aspect ratio, competition gliders, high aspect ratio. There you go. Okay, it's a bit like a blackbird compared to an albatross, if you see what I mean, in terms of glide. The high aspect ratio gets it every time, but an albatross would struggle to land in a small area, as you're probably aware. Okay, so that's aspect ratio. That's a picture there of a high aspect ratio glider. Okay, center of pressure. Center of pressure, this is a little diagram here. You're probably familiar with this diagram already, showing all the forces on an aerofoil. They all act through a black spot there shown on this diagram in the middle, and that is the center of pressure. Now, it doesn't exist. It's no good looking at your paraglider or your hang glider looking for the center of pressure because you won't find it. It's a theoretical point through which the forces are balanced or can be said to be acting, really. So it's just a useful thing. In actual fact, the wing generates different amounts of lift over the whole span, and it's quite a complex picture. However, center of pressure just makes it easier, and it's an important thing to know about. When the angle of attack is changed, the center of pressure moves slightly. So this is something that designers need to keep track of to deal with stability of the aircraft. Anyway, that's what center of pressure is. Okay, next terms are pitch, roll and yaw, and these are the way that a paraglider or indeed any aircraft move. So pitch, be familiar with that, fore and aft. So technically it is a rotation through a longitudinal axis. Now uniquely in a paraglider, the rotation point is not up in the wing, it's somewhere sort of just above your head. It might, I guess, I don't know exactly where it is to be perfectly honest. It might be within your body because you're the heaviest thing, but that's where you pitch. So it's a rotation about that axis. So that's pitch, so nose up and down basically. Roll, the next one. Roll is a rotation through a longitudinal axis. So you imagine something, a long line going straight at you and out the back. So you're rolling like that. One wing up, one wing down. It's a rolling action. And then finally, yaw is the other way. It's a rotation through a vertical axis, so straight down through your head, if you like. Pitch is fairly self-evident. That's, you know, speeding up and slowing down and what have you. When you turn a paraglider, it's actually a mixture of yaw and roll, and it starts to twist slightly through the yaw axis, but banks as well. And it's impossible to turn completely flat. So it's always a roll yaw coupling. And those things working together in harmony, and indeed pitch has an action as well, because as soon as you're banked, when you push the nose up, you're also pushing it round the corner, if you see what I mean. So pitch, roll and yaw are all interlinked, and that's how a glider makes a coordinated turn. So just so that you understand what those terms are. We've already touched with an aerofoil on the forces that you'll remember. We've seen it a couple of times. So I'm just going to talk here about how you can adjust them slightly. The manufacturer designer sets the glider with a trim speed, so, you know, hands off as it were, where it'll fly at with a certain amount of drag, certain amount of lift at a certain airspeed, depending on the wing loading. But we as pilots can adjust it slightly. So what we can do is we can adjust the resultant slightly. So we have the resultant, you may remember, is made up of drag operating backwards and lift operating forwards and upwards there. So you can see it on the diagram here. So what happens to this if you add more drag? And you can do that by flying much more quickly, or you can do it by flying very slowly. You know, get down below the trim speed, you add more drag. Well, in that case, the drag arrow gets longer, the lift arrow is relatively shorter, and the direction of the flight gets steeper. So by affecting the ratio between lift and drag, we can actually affect the angle at which we are gliding. So those two things are related, the lift-drag ratio and the glide angle that you can achieve. The glide angle over the ground is also, as mentioned in a previous session, dependent on headwinds and tailwinds as well. And we'll look at that in just a moment when we look at glider polars. But that's how you adjust the forces. In practice, on a paraglider, you do it by pushing on your speed bar, changing the speed at which you are flying. On a hang glider, you do it by pushing your bar in and out, obviously to adjust the angle of attack. So you change the angle of attack, you adjust those forces and change your lift drag ratio. So drag, we mentioned this as well. I'm going to go back and just reiterate. So a little bit more about induced drag. I've already told you in the first session that induced drag is caused by the pressure differential, or primarily by the pressure differential between the higher pressure below and the lower pressure on top. It's slightly more complicated than that. There's also a little bit of induced drag caused at the trailing edge of all the way across the wing, because the airflows are traveling at slightly different speeds, and that adds a little bit of induced drag. So induced drag just means drag that is induced by the action of the aerofoil generating lift, essentially. Also, although it's not shown in this diagram, the airflow over the top of the wing and the airflow underneath the wing are in slightly different directions as well. They actually diverge slightly, and when they recombine at the trailing edge or at the tips, that also adds to the generating the vortex which creates drag. Okay, this graph now shows what happens to induced drag as you speed up. So you can see here, as you increase airspeed, it reduces, and the reason for that is as you increase airspeed and you lower your angle of attack, the pressure difference between the top and the bottom of the wing reduces. Pressure difference reduces, not so much of a vortex. Simple as that. So a nice low angle of attack, not much lift, but not much drag either. So induced drag reduces with airspeed. And this is why we divide drag up into different components, because profile drag is quite different. So profile drag is the stuff that's just pushing against you, and that can be subdivided again into little bits. It's form drag, which is literally just my shape or whatever it is getting in the way of the airflow. Skin friction, So anyone who watching this who rides a bicycle knows perfectly well that if you wear baggy clothes, it makes more drag than something slippery. This is why sailplane pilots go out there with their pledge and polish their wings before competitions, try and reduce the skin friction a little bit. Doesn't actually explain why bumblebees are hairy, but anyway, let's not get into that. It's a bit beyond the scope of this lecture. And interference drag, slightly more subtle. Interference drag is where different airflows are recombining, so it's not that dissimilar to elements of induced drag. But anyway, it's just a slightly different. They're all subsets of profile drag. Okay. I think the probably best way to talk about interference drag is that you have profile drag on the front of something and interference drag behind it. You know, they sort of suck that way where the airflows are recombining. But the important thing is this: the profile drag versus speed relationship. It's exactly the opposite way. The faster you go, the more drag you get. And not only does it go that way, it's actually a very steep curve. If you double the airspeed, you square the amount of drag that you're producing. So the curve goes up and up, and very soon you reach a point where there's so much drag you just can't go any faster. So this is why a very underpowered car, let's say with 50 horsepower, will probably still do at 90 miles an hour. But in order to go at double that speed, you need vast amount, 450 horsepower or something like that. So because you need more and more power to overcome the drag, because the drag just increases and increases exponentially, which is why, of course, sports fast cars are all very smooth and slippery, and vans aren't very quick because they're big and generate lots of drag. So that's how it is. It's all to do with profile drag. Now then, you're probably well ahead of me in this. So you've got profile drag happening, which gets worse as you go faster, and you've got induced drag happening, which gets worse as you go slower. So we put them both on the same graph. Here we've got the induced drag and the profile drag, and we get them both together, we get the top curve there, which is the total drag. So that's all the drag operating. As you can see straight away, obviously the best place to be, the sweet spot as it were, is at the bottom of the U curve here. And that, coincidentally, is where the designers set all the lines, or whatever it is, or the hang point on your hang glider, to be at the normal trim speed. You tend to fly somewhere around the lowest drag, the best LD ratio, for still air at any rate. Okay, so that's the lift drag ratio, and that's total drag. So if you go fast, it degrades your glide. If you go slowly, it degrades your glide. So you just have a fairly small speed range, a very small speed range in terms of a low aspect ratio paraglider that is useful to us. Right, so we established that drag happens slightly different at different speeds. And for that reason, or that's one of the reasons, our sink rate varies at different speeds as well. That's the rate at which we're sinking down towards the ground. So there's the glide and there's the sink. But we can actually plot the sink rate. So we've got a thing called the polar curve. And this is a graph where on here is plotted the performance of the aircraft at different airspeeds. So it's the speed going horizontally versus the vertical, so the sink rate going vertically here. So the curve here shows the performance. So why are we interested in this? Well, because it tells us a lot about the performance of our aircraft. Once we've got a polar curve like this, we can mine it for information. So have a look at this. This point here, I've just put in with the arrow, suddenly it gets much worse, and that is the stall point. That's where the airflow starts to break up, so suddenly the sink rate goes through the roof. I mean, you'll see the curve doesn't go all the way this way, because from that point it goes down pretty well vertically. You're just falling, really. So that's the stall point, as we can work out where that is. The top of the curve, where the sink rate is the least, is the speed at which our minimum sink rate occurs. So obviously the minimum speed of sink. And we can look across, we draw another line the other way and work out what that is. So in this case, I think it's about 190 feet per minute, according to this. And we can also work out 180 feet I've put in there, okay, when it occurs. And that's at 22 kilometers per hour on this example. So that's how it works. At each point on the graph, you can work out what the speed is at which that sink rate is. So the faster you go, the worse your sink rate becomes. Okay, that's all in still air for this moment. It gets more complicated if we add sinking air and so forth. Another bit of information we can get from a polar curve is, just draw that again, is we can draw a tangent on it. So if I draw this, so that's going from the datum point where the two axes cross and out at an angle, and just touching the top of the curve there of the glider performance curve, the polar. What that does is it tells us where the best lift drag ratio is. So if I have a look at that, I can mark that out. The best glide speed on this aircraft in no wind, again, is 26 kilometers per hour. So that's fairly typical. The actual minimum sink rate is slightly slower than the best glide. So they do move around a little bit. So this introduces an interesting piloting conundrum. We don't actually fly at one speed all the time. Essentially, we fly at minimum sink rate when we're in lift, and we want to stay in that lift as long as possible, or maximize it, stay up for as long as possible. But if we're in still air and we want to go the furthest distance, we want to go a bit faster. And interestingly, we can also work out from this, if we draw another line, and I can't do it on here, and put it in with a bit of a headwind, we have to go faster still. If you imagine it starts from a higher point up there, faster still. You start getting into speed bar territory if you're trying to get your best glide over the ground into a headwind. So it's all about speed to fly. And having an idea of the performance of your glider and understanding the principles is very useful in helping you fly efficiently. Very commonly, inexperienced pilots fly a bit too slowly. And the reason they do this is if you fly slowly, you get more lift and everything happens more slowly, so you've got more time to think. So that's great. So if you get an experienced and an inexperienced pilot in the same bits of patchy lift, they both go up the same because they both fly at minimum sink rate. What happens then is you go through a bit of a sinking patch, and the inexperienced pilots tend to still fly slowly, so they sink because they're in it for longer, whereas the experienced pilot thinks, oh yeah, no lift here, and they put their speed bar on it, at least let the, and they glide a bit further to the next bit of lift, and they both go up again. And this keeps happening, and eventually the good guy gets higher, not because he's better at using the lift, but because he's better at managing the sinking air by flying a bit faster. So basically, you're not lifting, you should be at trim speed, and if you're trying to go into a wind at all, you should probably have a bit of speed bar on as well. So using the speed range of your glider efficiently is what it's all about. Anyway, went off at a bit of a tangent there. So turning and wing loading. This is where it gets a little more complex. The forces on the aerofoil, I've always talked about it being horizontal at the moment, but if you bank it up, put a bit of roll in there, then it gets slightly different. When we turn, we do two things. We add drag, and also, because you imagine we're swinging out, we're actually increasing our wing loading a little bit of G-force on there. So if you do that gently, sort of 30-degree bank, it's not a big difference, 10%, if that. But interestingly, if you do a steep bank, you start winding up, say a spiral dive or something like that, or a wing over, we're doing 60 degrees of bank, then you've doubled your G-force, you've doubled the load. So we're now pulling 2G. It doesn't particularly feel too bad at 2G. But the important thing about this is it's changed the forces on the airfoil. Some of the lift is now operating horizontally. I'll just put it in the picture. So you've got some vertical lift, but not as much as before, and some of the lift is now operating horizontally. So your resultant, which is going straight out opposite to the direction of you, if you see what I mean, is meaning that you are not generating as much lift on the aircraft in the vertical direction, and therefore the angle at which you reach the stall is going to be occur at a higher airspeed. Okay, so I'll just follow that through in a little bit more detail. So if you load up the glider and you bank, and you do this by banking up, but if you load up the glider, the speed at which you stall is going to increase. The stall is caused by it reaching a certain angle. But the airspeed it occurs at is usually pretty much the same. But when you bank up, it can't. And the reason I'm telling you all this is that a paraglider will, and a hang glider is the same, will turn fine, and it will stall quite evenly at a similar position. But if you're turning it and then you slow down, it's very easy for it to stall. And one of the commonest problems, fortunately hang gliders and paragliders don't stall particularly easily, but one of the commonest problems with light aircraft or sailplanes or whatever is pilots coming into land and they're going a little bit slowly because they're getting near the ground or whatever, and they try and turn back, and the actual act of turning whilst flying at the same speed pushes them over that sort of magic limit into the critical angle of attack, and they stall. Which is why aircraft always line up with reasonable speed, they line up on the runway and then they slow down on the thing. They don't actually slow down as they turn. So we are subject to this, particularly hang gliders. When you are making a turn, particularly if you're close to the ground, keep a little bit of airspeed on. And this is the reason. Once you're banked, you're more likely to stall. And if you stall and you're banked, it probably won't be a straightforward stall. You'll probably spin or something like that. So turning is fine. Flying slowly is fine. Turning tightly and flying slowly is not fine. That's more or less the takeaway message. Okay. Okay, that's basically it. That's all I've got to. At the moment, this is been building on the first principles of flight session. Therefore, so this is sort of up to kind of club pilot level. There will be some more on this in future sessions. I hope you found that interesting.